The doctor placed both hands on the German boy's neck. He had examined hundreds of wounded soldiers over 3 years of war. He had touched shattered bones, rotting tissue, and wounds that would make the devil himself flinch. But what he felt beneath the skin of this 17-year-old prisoner made him pull his hands back as if he had touched fire. Not from disgust, but because what he had just touched could not possibly exist inside a living body. The boy's cervical spine had been crushed. Not last week, not last month, 4 months ago. And yet here he stood staring straight ahead because he could not turn his head to look in any other direction. What happened next would force an American doctor to choose between following the rules and letting the boy die, or breaking every boundary to save the life of an enemy. But before you learn what he chose, you need to understand how this boy survived 4 months of hell with a broken neck that no one bothered to fix. This is the story of Werner Hoffman, and it begins on a dusty afternoon in Alabama, in a place most Americans have never heard of. Camp Aliceville sat in the middle of rural Alabama, 12 miles from the nearest town by dirt road. When the transport truck carrying prisoners stopped at the main gate, the November sun had already tilted toward the west, painting the rows of wooden barracks in shades of burnt orange. The wind carried the smell of dry grass and smoke from the camp kitchen, the scent of smoked meat that the exhausted German soldiers on the truck did not recognize. Werner Hoffman was the 47th man to step off the truck that afternoon. He was 17 years old, so thin that his torn German uniform hung from his shoulders like clothes on a wire hanger. His hair was pale yellow, dirty matted against his forehead. His eyes were gray-blue, the color of a German winter sky that he did not know if he would ever see again. But what caught the attention of the American guards was not his haggard appearance. Plenty of prisoners arrived looking half dead. What they noticed was the way he moved. When his name was called from the left side, Werner did not turn his head. He rotated his entire body's shoulders, hips, legs like a wooden block placed on a spinning platform. The motion was so stiff, so unnatural that it looked mechanical, as if someone had poured concrete into his neck. Corporal William Porter, the intake officer recording names, barked an order. "Turn your head to the left." Werner did not move. His eyes shifted left, but his head remained fixed, staring straight ahead. "Turn your head to the right." Nothing. Porter wrote something in his ledger and waved Werner forward into the camp. He assumed it was defiance, the stubborn attitude of a prisoner who had just lost a war. He had seen it before. These Germans came off the boats with their pride still intact, refusing to cooperate on principle. But Nurse Margaret Sullivan, standing a few steps away near the medical building, did not think it was defiance. She had worked at the Camp Aliceville infirmary for 8 months. She had seen defiant prisoners. She had also seen wounded prisoners. The way this boy moved, it did not look like stubbornness. It looked like his body was trying to protect something that would cause terrible consequences if he moved the wrong way. She stepped closer to Werner and spoke slowly in English, even though she knew he probably did not understand. "Your neck. What is wrong with your neck?" Werner looked at her. His eyes moved, but his head did not. He said one word in German. "Kaputt." Broken, finished, done. Sullivan felt a chill run down her spine despite the warm Alabama afternoon. She turned and walked quickly toward the medical building to find Dr. Whitfield. But she did not know that what she had just witnessed was only the surface of something far more terrible. Dr. Robert Whitfield was 52 years old and had worked at Camp Aliceville since March of 1944. He was not a military doctor. He was a civilian physician contracted by the War Department specializing in bone and spinal injuries. Before the war, he had run a small clinic in Montgomery where he treated farmers who broke bones falling off horses and factory workers whose limbs were crushed by machinery. The war had changed him, not in the way people usually expected. He had not become hardened or numb. If anything, he had become more sensitive to suffering, perhaps because he had seen so much of it. Every wound he treated reminded him of his own son Daniel, 24 years old, fighting somewhere in the Pacific. Every night he prayed that if Daniel was ever wounded, there would be a doctor on the other side who would treat his son as a patient, not as an enemy. That was why he had examined hundreds of German prisoners without discrimination. That was also why he had seen some of the most horrific injuries that war could produce. But he had never seen anything like this. Werner sat on the examination table, his back straight as a wooden plank. He did not move when Dr. Whitfield entered the room. He did not turn his head when the doctor stood to his left. "Turn your head to the left," Dr. Whitfield said, even though he knew the boy did not understand English. He used hand gestures to demonstrate. Werner's eyes shifted, but his head did not move even a fraction of an inch. To the right, still nothing. Dr. Whitfield placed both hands on either side of Werner's jaw and applied gentle pressure, testing whether the joint was simply stiff or whether something structural was preventing motion. The moment he pushed, Werner inhaled sharply through his teeth, a sound of pure pain that needed no translation. His eyes watered instantly. Whitfield stopped immediately. He moved his hands to the back of the boy's neck, feeling along the vertebrae. What he found made him motion for Nurse Sullivan to come closer without saying a word. The spine was not smooth. There were hard ridges and uneven surfaces where the bone should have been uniform. The tissue around the upper vertebrae was swollen and hardened like stone. When Whitfield pressed just below the base of the skull, Werner jerked forward and nearly vomited from the pain. Whitfield stepped back. He looked at Sullivan, and for the first time in 8 months of working together, she saw fear in his eyes. "Call Birmingham," he said. "Request the X-ray equipment. Urgent. Camp Aliceville did not have the equipment to image bone structures in detail." Without an X-ray, Whitfield was working blind. But even without the image, he already had a theory, and it was not a comforting one. The boy's neck was not stiff because of muscle strain or temporary inflammation. The spine itself had been damaged, possibly fractured, and the body had tried to repair it by fusing the bones together in whatever position they were held during the injury. This meant Werner had been living with a locked neck for months, perhaps since the summer. Sullivan asked the question that both of them were thinking. How long has he been like this? Whitfield shook his head slowly. "I do not know, but I am guessing months, maybe longer. If the injury had happened recently, the pain would be sharper and the swelling more severe. What this boy is showing looks like an old wound that healed incorrectly." He paused, then added quietly, "Which raises another question. If this boy could not turn his head, how did he fight? How did he survive combat and transport and capture without being able to look left or right?" Sullivan had no answer, neither did Whitfield. But they both knew they were looking at something that should not exist. A boy who should have been paralyzed or dead standing in front of them alive. 3 days passed while they waited for the X-ray equipment. 3 days of Werner Hoffman lying on a medical cot, staring up at the wooden plank ceiling, trying not to think about the past. But the past would not leave him alone. It came at night when the infirmary was quiet and he could hear crickets chirping outside the window. It came in the form of explosions, the artillery barrage that still echoed in his dreams. It came in the form of pressure, the sensation of a giant hand pressing down on the top of his head, crushing his spine into the ground. On the second night, he woke at 3 in the morning, drenched in sweat, his hands gripping the edge of the cot. Nurse Sullivan was on night duty. She heard his ragged breathing and came to his bedside. "Nightmare?" she asked gently, even though she knew he did not understand. Werner looked at her. In the darkness, his eyes were like 2 deep wells. He did not answer, but his hands were trembling. Sullivan sat down in the chair beside his cot. She did not touch him. She just sat there silent, as if her presence alone was enough. After a while, Werner spoke, his voice hoarse and cracked. "Mutter, mother." Sullivan did not speak German, but she understood that word. Every language had that word, and it always sounded the same when spoken by a frightened child far from home. She nodded. "I know," she said softly. "I know." Werner closed his eyes. He did not fall back asleep, but he stopped trembling. In that moment, in a prisoner of war camp in the middle of Alabama, a German boy and an American nurse shared something that needed no translation. The universal language of human comfort in the face of fear. On the 4th day, the X-ray equipment arrived from Birmingham, along with a radiologist named Lieutenant James Mercer. Mercer set up a portable unit in one of the camp storage buildings and brought Werner in under guard, though the guard quickly realized there was no need for restraint. The boy was cooperative, almost passive, following every instruction without resistance. "Lie down on the table, stay still, do not move your head." Werner did exactly what he was told. Mercer took 4 images, front, back, left side, right side. When the films were developed an hour later, Mercer did not wait for a formal meeting. He walked directly to Dr. Whitfield's office with the X-rays in hand and clipped them onto the light box without saying a word. Whitfield stood up, moved closer, and stared at the images for nearly a full minute before he spoke. The third and fourth cervical vertebrae, the bones that should allow the neck to rotate and flex, were fractured in multiple places. But the fractures were not clean breaks. They were compression fractures, the kind caused by a sustained vertical force, as if something extremely heavy had pressed down on the top of Werner's head and crushed the vertebrae from above. What made the images even more disturbing was the calcification. The body had tried to repair the damage by laying down new bone tissue. But because Werner never had access to proper medical care, the bones had fused together in a crooked, uneven mass. His third and fourth vertebrae were now essentially one solid block of malformed bone. That was why his neck could not move. Mercer pointed to a shadow on the left side of the spine. Scar tissue from an old hematoma, he said. The boy also bled internally when the injury first occurred. Whitfield asked the question that had been gnawing at him since the first examination. How is this boy still alive? Mercer did not have a definitive answer, but he had a theory. If the fracture had been even a few millimeters higher or deeper, it would have severed the spinal cord. The boy would have been paralyzed or killed instantly. Instead, the fracture crushed the bones but left the cord intact. That meant he kept all of his motor function below the neck. He could walk, he could run, he could use his arms, he could carry a rifle. He just could not turn his head. Whitfield wrote one word in his notes and underlined it twice: adrenaline. But that explanation did not satisfy him. Compression fractures in the cervical spine were agonizingly painful. They usually required immediate immobilization and surgery. Werner had neither: no surgery, no traction, no stabilization. And yet he had walked out of whatever battlefield he was injured on and kept going for 4 months. The next step was to interview Werner directly, but they needed an interpreter first. Theodore Reinhardt arrived on the 5th day. They called him Ted. He was a corporal from Milwaukee whose parents had immigrated from Bavaria in 1905. He had grown up speaking both German and English at home, a skill that the Army had found useful for interrogating prisoners. Ted sat across from Werner in the medical office. Dr. Whitfield stood in the corner of the room observing. Ted began with simple questions to establish trust. What is your name, Werner Hoffman? How old are you? 17. Almost 18. When were you drafted? March of 1944. Ted paused. March of 1944 was only 3 months before D-Day. This boy had barely finished basic training before being thrown into the inferno of the Western Front. Then Ted asked the critical question. What happened to your neck? Werner hesitated. For a moment it looked like he would refuse to answer, but then he started talking slowly at first, and Ted translated sentence by sentence. Werner had been assigned to a panzer unit in France during the summer of 1944, shortly after the Allied invasion at Normandy. He was not a tank driver or a gunner. He was part of the ground crew, the soldiers who ran alongside the tanks and protected them from infantry attacks. His unit was caught in an artillery barrage near the town of Falaise in August. Werner was crouched behind a half-track when a shell landed less than 20 meters away. He did not remember the explosion itself. He only remembered the pressure. It felt like a giant hand pressed down on the top of my head, Werner said, his voice flat and distant, and shoved my spine into the ground. When he woke up, he was lying on his side in a ditch. His neck would not move. He could not lift his head. He could not turn it left or right. The pain was so severe that he vomited twice and then passed out again. When he woke the second time, the artillery barrage was over. Most of his unit was dead or scattered. Ted stopped translating and looked at Dr. Whitfield. Both men understood what they were hearing. This boy had suffered a catastrophic spinal injury in the middle of a battlefield retreat, and somehow impossibly he had survived. But the story was not over. What happened next should not have been survivable. But Werner Hoffman did not know that. He only knew that he had to keep moving or die. Werner crawled out of the ditch and found 2 other soldiers from his company. Both were wounded but mobile. One of them, an older man named Dietrich Vogel, told him that the regiment was retreating toward the Seine River. If they did not move fast, they would be surrounded by Canadian forces. Werner tried to stand. His legs worked, but his head stayed locked in place, hanging at an awkward angle, refusing to move. Dietrich looked at him and said something that Werner would remember for the rest of his life. Hold your head with both hands. Keep it steady while you walk. Werner did exactly that. He placed both hands on either side of his jaw and the base of his skull, holding his own head in place like a fragile object that might shatter if dropped. And he started walking. 17 kilometers. Through French farmland, under moonlight. past bombed villages and burning haystacks. One step at a time with both hands holding his head steady. Every step sent pain radiating down his spine. Every stumble threatened to shift the broken bones and paralyze him forever. But he kept walking because the alternative was death. When they reached the fallback position, Werner could barely stand, but he was alive. Ted paused in his translation and asked Werner a follow-up question. "Did you see a medic?" Werner nodded carefully. He said he saw a field medic the next day at a mobile hospital. The medic told him his neck was broken, but there was nothing they could do. No surgery available, no hospital with the right equipment. The regiment was moving again in 6 hours. The medic gave Werner a roll of gauze, a wooden splint, and a handful of morphine tablets. He told Werner to wrap the splint around his neck to keep it stable and to take the morphine when the pain became unbearable. Then the medic moved on to the next patient. Werner spent the next 4 months fighting, retreating, and surviving with a cervical spine that had been fractured and never repaired. He wore the makeshift splint for 3 weeks until the gauze rotted and fell apart. After that, he learned to manage without it. He kept his head as still as possible. He rotated his entire upper body whenever he needed to look in a different direction. His squad mates made jokes at first. They called him the statue and the wooden soldier. But the jokes stopped after the first time Werner shot an enemy soldier without turning his head. He had learned to aim using only his peripheral vision and his body rotation. He learned to sleep sitting up because lying down sent sharp pains through his skull. The morphine ran out after 2 weeks. Werner never received more. He managed the pain by staying in motion because standing still made him focus on the pressure in his neck, and focusing on it made it worse. He ate when food was available, which was not often. He drank water from rivers and shared canteens. His weight dropped. His endurance suffered. But his neck stabilized in its fused position, and the acute pain gradually became a chronic ache that he could tolerate. He never told his officers about the severity of the injury. Admitting it would have meant being left behind. And being left behind in a retreating German army in late 1944 usually meant being captured, executed, or abandoned to die. Werner was finally captured in November near the German border when his unit ran out of ammunition and surrendered to an American patrol. The American soldiers searched him, took his rifle, and marched him to a temporary holding area with 40 other prisoners. No one noticed his neck during the initial processing. Werner had learned to move carefully and avoid drawing attention. He was loaded onto a truck, then a train, then a ship, then another train that brought him to Alabama. It was not until the intake line at Camp Aliceville that an American guard noticed the way he held his head and flagged him for medical review. And now here he was, sitting in a medical office telling his story to an interpreter and a doctor who looked at him as if he were a ghost, because in many ways he was. After the interview, Dr. Whitfield sat alone in his office. In front of him were the X-ray films, Reinhardt's notes, and a blank sheet of paper. He knew what needed to be done. The Geneva Convention of 1929 required nations to provide necessary medical treatment to prisoners of war. Werner's injury clearly threatened his life. If the fused bone mass shifted even slightly, it could compress the spinal cord and cause permanent paralysis or death. It could happen in 5 years. It could happen tomorrow. But Whitfield also knew the reality. Complex spinal surgery was not typically provided to prisoners of war. Medical resources, neurosurgeons, operating rooms, recovery time were prioritized for Allied personnel. Asking for an exception would require paperwork, justification, and approval from people who might not see a German prisoner as worth the effort. Whitfield began writing a request to transfer Werner to a military hospital with a neurosurgery department. He cited the Geneva Convention. He emphasized the life-threatening nature of the injury. He outlined the medical necessity in clinical terms designed to cut through bureaucratic resistance. Then he submitted the request to the camp's chief medical officer for approval. What Whitfield did not know was that someone else had already heard about Werner Hoffmann, someone who had a very different opinion about how German prisoners should be treated. Sergeant Harold Jennings was 45 years old and served as the head of security at Camp Aliceville. He was not a bad man in the simple sense. He did not beat prisoners. He did not insult them. He just did not care about their comfort. And he had a reason. His only son, Private First Class Thomas Jennings, 19 years old, had died on Omaha Beach on June 6, 1944. D-Day. The boy had not even fired a single shot. He was killed the moment the landing craft door opened, cut down by German machine gun fire before his boots touched sand. Jennings received the news about his son's death 2 weeks later. He did not cry. He did not scream. He simply folded the letter, put it in his pocket, and continued working. But from that day forward, Jennings looked at every German prisoner in the camp with the same thought running through his mind. One of these men might have killed my son. He did not seek revenge through violence. He sought it through the system. Every time someone requested improved conditions for prisoners, more blankets, better food, more rest time, Jennings found a reason to deny it. Paperwork incomplete, procedure not followed, resources unavailable. He never violated regulations. He just used regulations as a weapon. When Jennings heard about Dr. Whitfield's request to transfer a German prisoner to a major military hospital for complex surgery, he walked to the chief medical officer's office before any decision could be made. The confrontation happened the next morning. Captain George Morrison's office was a small room with a wooden desk, 2 chairs, and a map of the United States on the wall. When Dr. Whitfield entered, he found Jennings already sitting there. Dr. Morrison said, "Sergeant Jennings has some concerns about your request." Whitfield looked at Jennings. The two men had encountered each other many times over the past 8 months, but they had never been in direct conflict. "What concerns?" Whitfield asked, keeping his voice level. Jennings spoke calmly. "The Geneva Convention requires necessary medical treatment. The question is whether complex spinal surgery qualifies as necessary or merely desirable." Whitfield controlled his voice carefully. "Without surgery, the boy will die." "The boy has survived 4 months without surgery," Jennings replied. "It seems his body has adapted. Are we certain intervention is required? Or are we using valuable resources for a theoretical risk?" Whitfield wanted to punch Jennings in the face. He restrained himself, but only barely. "The risk is not theoretical," he said. "I have X-ray films showing that the bone could shift at any moment. If that happens, the boy will be paralyzed or dead within minutes." Jennings nodded as if considering the argument. "And how many neurosurgeons do we have available? How many hospital beds? How many hours of operating time? Meanwhile, how many American soldiers are waiting for treatment?" Whitfield fell silent. This was the point he could not easily counter. "I am not saying we refuse," Jennings continued smoothly. "I am simply saying we need to examine this more carefully. We need an opinion from an Army neurosurgeon before deciding. That is standard procedure." Morrison, who had sat quietly throughout the exchange, finally spoke. "The sergeant has a point. We will request an evaluation from a neurosurgeon before approving the transfer. Dr. Whitfield, please prepare a complete file." Whitfield knew this was a delay tactic. Requesting an evaluation could take weeks. In those weeks, anything could happen to Werner. But he also knew this was a battle he could not win through direct confrontation. He needed another approach. That night, Dr. Whitfield went to the infirmary alone. Werner was awake, staring up at the ceiling. Whitfield pulled a chair next to the cot and sat down. He did not speak German, and Werner did not speak English, but sometimes presence was enough. He looked at the boy, 17 years old, thin as a rail, with a neck that could kill him at any moment, and he thought about his own son. Daniel was about this age when he enlisted. Daniel could be lying somewhere right now, wounded, waiting for a doctor to decide whether his life was worth saving. Whitfield had a secret that he had never told anyone. In 1938, he had watched a patient die because he did not have the courage to fight the system. The patient was a black factory worker whose leg had been crushed by machinery. The hospital in Montgomery refused to perform surgery, citing lack of resources. The real reason was that the patient was not white. Whitfield knew it was wrong. He knew he should fight, should argue, should do whatever it took to save the man. But he had done nothing. He had stayed silent. And the patient had died. From that day forward, Whitfield carried the shame like an invisible scar. He became more careful, more gentle with patients. But he also became more timid when facing the system. Now looking at Werner, he knew this was his chance to correct the mistake he made years ago. Or this was his chance to repeat it. Werner suddenly spoke, his voice a hoarse whisper. Warum? Why? Whitfield did not understand the word, but he understood the question in the boy's eyes. Why did he care? Why was he trying? Werner was the enemy, a prisoner, a burden. Whitfield placed his hand on Werner's shoulder gently, carefully, so as not to move his neck, and spoke. Because you are a patient, and I am a doctor. Werner did not understand the English words, but he understood the tone. He understood the look in the doctor's eyes. For the first time since being captured, he felt that maybe, just maybe, someone on the other side actually wanted to help him. Outside the infirmary window, the Alabama night was quiet. Crickets sang in the darkness. Somewhere in the distance, a guard's boots crunched on gravel. And in a small room in the middle of a prisoner of war camp, a German boy and an American doctor shared a moment that transcended language, transcended war, transcended everything that was supposed to make them enemies. But the battle was far from over. Sergeant Jennings was already planning his next move. The paperwork requesting additional evaluation was just the beginning. He had other tools at his disposal, other ways to delay, to obstruct, to ensure that resources meant for American soldiers were not wasted on German prisoners. And Dr. Whitfield did not yet know how far he would have to go to save Werner Hoffman's life. The clock was ticking. The bone could shift at any moment. And somewhere between mercy and bureaucracy, a 17-year-old boy waited to learn whether he would live or die. What happened next would test everything Dr. Whitfield believed about duty honor and what it meant to be a healer in a world at war. 2 weeks had passed since Dr. Whitfield submitted the transfer request. 2 weeks of Werner Hoffman lying on a medical cot with a neck that could kill him at any moment. 2 weeks of waiting for an answer that never came. The request for evaluation from a neurosurgeon had been sent, but instead of receiving an appointment date, Whitfield received a series of follow-up questions. Additional x-rays from different angles were needed. A detailed report on the prisoner's medical history was required. Confirmation from the German military unit about the exact date of injury was requested. Each question seemed reasonable on its own. Each requirement appeared necessary when examined individually, but taken together they formed a maze of paperwork designed to delay indefinitely. Whitfield knew who was behind it. Jennings never appeared directly, but his fingerprints were everywhere. In the overly detailed questions, in the nearly impossible requirements, in the bureaucratic obstacles that multiplied like weeds after rain. On the morning of the 14th day, Whitfield received the latest request. Written confirmation from the German field hospital, where Werner was first examined, was now required before any transfer could be approved. Whitfield slammed his hand on his desk so hard that the coffee cup rattled. That field hospital had probably been bombed. The medic who examined Werner was probably dead. The medical records probably never existed in the first place. This was a request that could never be fulfilled, and the person who made it knew that perfectly well. Whitfield sat in his office, staring at the paper, feeling the familiar weight of helplessness pressing down on his shoulders. He had seen this before. He had felt this before. The system grinding forward, indifferent to human suffering, while he sat paralyzed by procedure and protocol. He thought about the factory worker in 1938, the man whose leg could have been saved, the man who died because Whitfield did not have the courage to fight. Was he going to let it happen again? But Whitfield did not know that in a few hours everything would change. The careful calculations of delay and obstruction were about to be shattered by something no one could control. The scream came from the infirmary at 3 o'clock in the afternoon. Nurse Sullivan was the first to reach Werner's bedside. She found him convulsing on the cot, hands clawing at the sheets, eyes rolled back in his head. He was screaming in German words she did not understand, but she understood the agony in his voice. "Doctor." "Whitfield," she shouted down the hallway. Whitfield arrived within a minute. Werner was lying on his side, his entire body trembling, sweat soaking through his clothes. The pain seemed to radiate from his neck and spread down his entire spine like fire following a fuse. "Hold him still," Whitfield ordered. "Do not let his neck move." Sullivan and another nurse held Werner in place while Whitfield examined him. The boy was experiencing a severe muscle spasm. The muscles around his neck, already stretched tight as piano wire from 4 months of compensating for broken vertebrae, had suddenly gone into uncontrolled contraction. Whitfield administered morphine to reduce the pain and relax the muscles. After 10 minutes, Werner gradually calmed down, but his eyes remained wide open, filled with terror. When Whitfield examined him again, he found what he had feared most: new swelling around the cervical vertebrae. The fused bone mass might be shifting. He pulled Sullivan into the hallway and spoke in a low voice. "If we do not do something, this boy may not survive the week." Sullivan looked at him. "What are you going to do?" Whitfield was silent for a moment. Then he said something that would change everything. "I'm going to call Atlanta directly." The telephone connection from Camp Aliceville to Atlanta was poor. Static and interference made conversation difficult. But Dr. Whitfield waited patiently until he was connected to the neurosurgery department at Lawson General Hospital. The man who answered was Major Charles Crawford, 48 years old, head of the neurosurgery unit. Crawford had performed dozens of spinal surgeries during the war, most of them on American soldiers wounded in combat. He was known for two things: exceptional surgical skill and a bluntness that bordered on rudeness. Whitfield described the case over the crackling phone line. Compression fracture of C3 and C4 untreated for 4 months, self-fused in incorrect position. I just documented a severe muscle spasm episode and new swelling. I believe the bone mass is shifting. Silence on the other end. Then Crawford asked a question. How old is the patient? 17. Nationality German. Prisoner of war. The silence stretched longer this time. Whitfield thought Crawford would refuse. He had every reason to refuse. Limited resources, priority for American personnel, the political complications of performing major surgery on an enemy combatant. But Crawford said something unexpected. Send me the x-rays. If the situation is as serious as you describe, I will evaluate the case personally and make the decision myself. No committees, no reviews, just me. Whitfield almost sighed with relief into the telephone. One more thing, Crawford added. I have heard there are people trying to delay this case. If that is true, tell them that when I decide to operate, no one has the authority to stop me. The Geneva Convention is not a suggestion. It is law. Whitfield hung up the phone and sat still for a moment. For the first time in 2 weeks, he felt something he had almost forgotten. Hope. But Sergeant Jennings was not finished. Jennings learned about Whitfield's phone call within 24 hours. He had contacts in the camp communications office, and nothing important happened without his knowledge. He did not get angry. Jennings never got angry, at least not visibly. He simply adjusted his strategy. If he could not stop the surgery through medical paperwork, he would stop it through security channels. That night, Jennings composed a report addressed to the War Department. In the report, he raised concerns about the security risk of transferring a German prisoner to a major military hospital. Lawson General Hospital treated hundreds of American officers every day. They had access to sensitive information about units' battle plans and strategic positions. Bringing a German prisoner into that environment, even a 17-year-old boy with a broken neck, could potentially compromise security. The report did not need to be accurate. It only needed to create enough doubt that someone in Washington would request further review. Jennings sent the report through official channels and waited. He did not know that his calculation had already been overtaken by events. The x-rays were on their way to Atlanta. Major Crawford was already reviewing the case. And the clock was ticking on Werner Hoffman's life in ways that no amount of paperwork could slow down. 3 days after the phone call, Dr. Whitfield sat alone in his office at 2 in the morning. On the desk in front of him was a letter he had just finished writing, a resignation letter addressed to the War Department. In the letter, he stated that he could no longer work within a system that treated human lives as numbers on a balance sheet. His hand trembled as he held the pen. He thought about Werner lying in the infirmary a few dozen meters away, with a neck that could kill him at any moment. He thought about the factory worker in 1938, the man he had failed to save because he was too afraid to challenge the system. He thought about his son Daniel somewhere in the Pacific, perhaps wounded, perhaps waiting for a doctor to decide whether his life was worth fighting for. Whitfield looked at the resignation letter in his hand. If he resigned, he would be free. Free from the bureaucracy, free from the politics, free from the weight of fighting battles he was not sure he could win. But if he resigned, who would fight for Werner? He sat there for a long time, the letter in his hand, the clock ticking on the wall, the night pressing against the windows like a living thing. Then he made his decision. He tore the letter in half. He was not going to resign. He was not going to run away. He was going to fight, not because he was certain he would win, but because some battles had to be fought regardless of the outcome, because some lives were worth saving regardless of the cost, because he had spent 7 years carrying the weight of one failure and he would not add another. Whitfield threw the torn pieces of the letter into the trash can and stood up. Tomorrow he would call Atlanta again. He would push harder. He would do whatever it took. Werner Hoffman was going to get his surgery, or Whitfield would go down fighting. The answer came the next morning, and it came from an unexpected direction. Jennings' security report had reached Washington. It had been reviewed by a senior officer whose name Whitfield never learned. And that officer had written a response that would be quoted in military circles for years afterward. The note was brief and devastating. "This is a 17-year-old boy with a broken neck, not a Gestapo agent. Approve the transfer immediately." The note also contained a condition. If the surgery was successful, Werner had to be returned to Camp Aliceville within 3 months. No exceptions, no extensions. Whitfield knew 3 months was not enough time for proper recovery from complex spinal surgery, but it was the only condition that would allow the surgery to happen at all. He accepted. On the morning of December 10th, 1944, Werner Hoffman was loaded into an ambulance for the 200-mile journey from Alabama to Atlanta. His neck was secured in a special brace, and a nurse rode with him to monitor his condition throughout the trip. The ambulance rolled down the dusty red roads of Alabama, past cotton fields and pine forests and small wooden houses, carrying a German prisoner toward an American hospital where doctors would try to save his life. Dr. Whitfield did not accompany the ambulance. He had to stay at the camp to continue his work, but he stood at the gate and watched until the vehicle disappeared around a bend in the road. Then he closed his eyes and said a prayer, the first prayer he had spoken in many years. Nurse Sullivan rode with Werner in the ambulance. She sat beside him and held his hand, a small gesture that required no translation. Werner looked out the ambulance window at the passing landscape. He had never seen America before. He had never imagined he would come here. And he had certainly never imagined that his enemies would be the ones trying to save his life. The Alabama countryside rolled past, fields of brown winter grass, stands of pine trees, farmhouses with smoke rising from chimneys. Everything was so different from the bombed cities and muddy battlefields he had known for the past year. So peaceful, so untouched by war. Werner thought about his mother in Dortmund, about his sister Liesel, about the small house where he had grown up, which might no longer exist. He thought about how far he was from home and how uncertain his future remained. But for the first time since August, he also thought about something else, the possibility that he might survive. The ambulance continued north toward Atlanta, toward the hospital, toward the surgery that would either save his life or end it. What happened in that operating room would determine everything. Lawson General Hospital in Atlanta was one of the largest military medical facilities in the southern United States. When the ambulance stopped in front of the main building, Werner saw hundreds of American soldiers. Some walked on their own. Some sat in wheelchairs. Some were carried on stretchers. Most had visible wounds, missing arms, legs in casts, bandages wrapped around heads. Werner was the only prisoner of war in the crowd. He was taken to a ward and assigned a bed. For 2 days he waited. Nurses came and went. Doctors examined him briefly, made notes, and left. The routine of a military hospital continued around him, indifferent to his presence. On the third day, Major Charles Crawford came to see him. Crawford was a tall, thin man with short gray hair, cut in military style. His eyes were sharp as scalpels, but his voice was surprisingly gentle. He carried the X-ray films and brought an interpreter with him. "I am going to explain exactly what will happen," Crawford said through the interpreter, "and I am not going to lie to you." Werner nodded carefully, the small motion that had become his only way of showing acknowledgement. "The surgery will involve cutting into the back of your neck through skin muscle and connective tissue to expose the damaged vertebrae. I will remove the malformed bone that has grown in the wrong position. I may need to insert a metal spacer between the vertebrae to hold them apart. Recovery will take months. You will be in pain. Significant pain." Werner did not speak. He had been in pain for 4 months. More pain was not what frightened him. "There are risks," Crawford continued. "Infection, bleeding, paralysis. You could die on the operating table. I am telling you this not to scare you, but so you understand." Werner finally spoke through the interpreter. "If I do not have the surgery, what happens?" Crawford answered directly. "You will live with the pain, and eventually the fused bones will press on your spinal cord. It could kill you in 5 years. It could kill you tomorrow." Werner was silent for a long moment. Then he asked another question, one that Crawford had not expected. "Why are you doing this for me? I am the enemy." Crawford paused. He looked at the boy 17 years old with the scar forming on his neck, with eyes that had seen too much death and pain for someone so young. Then he answered, "Because you are a patient, and I am a doctor. The war does not change that." Werner looked at Crawford. He did not understand all the English words, but he understood the meaning. He understood that there were things that transcended the boundaries of war, things that the Nazi propaganda had never told him about. Danke, Werner said quietly. Thank you. Crawford nodded. The surgery is scheduled for December 14th, 2 days from now. He turned and walked out of the room, leaving Werner alone with his thoughts. 2 days. In 2 days, Werner would either wake up with a functioning neck or he would not wake up at all. The night before the surgery, Werner could not sleep. He lay in his hospital bed staring up at the white ceiling, thinking about his mother. She was in Dortmund, a city that was being bombed almost every night. She did not know he was alive. She probably thought he had died in August when he disappeared from his unit. She might be mourning him right now, lighting candles in a ruined church, praying for a son who was lying in an American hospital 2 oceans away. He thought about his father who had died of tuberculosis when Werner was 12. He thought about Liesel, his 15-year-old sister, who was alone taking care of their mother while he was here half a world away. He thought about death. If he died tomorrow, who would know? Who would tell his mother? Who would mourn for him? Around 2 in the morning, the door to his room opened quietly. Nurse Sullivan stepped inside carrying a cup of warm water. I thought you might not be sleeping, she said softly, even though she knew he did not understand most of her words. Werner looked at her. She had been with him since Alabama. She had held his hand in the ambulance. She had stayed with him through the nights when he woke from nightmares. She was the closest thing to a friend he had in this country of enemies. Danke, he whispered. Thank you. Sullivan smiled. She set the cup down on the bedside table and sat in the chair beside his bed. I will stay here, she said. I will stay until you fall asleep. Werner did not understand the words, but he understood the intention. He closed his eyes. For the first time in many months, he fell asleep without nightmares. Outside the hospital window, the Atlanta night was quiet. Stars shone through gaps in the clouds. Somewhere in the distance, a train whistle echoed across the sleeping city. And in a small room on the 3rd floor, a German mall and an American nurse shared a moment of peace on the edge of an uncertain tomorrow. The morning of December 14th, 1944, arrived gray and cold. Werner was woken at 5 o'clock. He was bathed, dressed in a hospital gown, and placed on a gurney for transport to the preoperative area. Major Crawford was already there along with his surgical team, 2 assistant surgeons, 2 operating room nurses, an anesthesiologist. They were checking equipment, speaking in medical terminology that Werner could not follow. Before the anesthesia was administered, Crawford came to stand beside the gurney. Are you ready? He asked through the interpreter. Werner nodded, the small, careful motion that had been his only way of responding for 4 months. Good, Crawford said. When you wake up, you will be able to turn your head and look at me. Werner did not know if that promise would come true. But for the first time since August, he had hope. The anesthesiologist placed a mask over his face. The smell of ether filled his lungs. The world began to blur around the edges. Werner thought about his mother, about Dortmund, about the small house where he grew up. Then he thought nothing at all. The operating room fell silent except for the hiss of the anesthesia machine and the steady beep of the heart monitor. Major Crawford took his position behind the unconscious patient. The surgical lights blazed down on the exposed neck. Scalpels and clamps and drills waited on sterile trays. Crawford took a deep breath. Then he made the first incision. The surgery began at 7 in the morning. Werner lay face down on the operating table, his head secured in a metal frame to keep his spine completely immobilized. Major Crawford stood behind him, surgical lights blazing down on the exposed neck, illuminating every detail of what he was about to attempt. The first incision opened the skin, revealing muscle and connective tissue beneath. Crawford worked slowly, deliberately, cutting through each layer with the precision of a man who understood that one wrong move could mean paralysis or death. When the vertebrae finally came into view, Crawford understood why this boy was still alive. It was nothing short of a medical miracle. The 3rd and 4th cervical vertebrae were encased in a thick layer of calcified tissue. The body had tried desperately to repair itself, laying down new bone in a frantic attempt to stabilize the injury. But without proper medical care, the bone had grown wild and wrong, fusing the 2 vertebrae together at a crooked angle. The joint between them had completely disappeared, replaced by a solid mass of malformed calcium deposits. This was why Werner could not turn his head. His neck had essentially become one rigid block of bone from the base of his skull to his shoulders. Crawford used a surgical drill to carefully remove the calcified overgrowth. He worked in tiny increments, advancing millimeter by millimeter because the spinal cord lay directly beneath. If the drill slipped, even slightly, Werner would be paralyzed forever. The process was exhausting. The precision required absolute concentration. Twice during the first 2 hours, Crawford paused to let his hands rest, flexing his fingers to maintain the fine motor control that separated success from catastrophe. The operating room was silent except for the whine of the drill and the steady beep of the heart monitor. No one spoke. No one moved unnecessarily. Every person in the room understood what was at stake. Then 2 hours into the surgery, something went wrong. Crawford had just removed a large piece of calcified bone when blood began to flow. More blood than expected. A small blood vessel compressed by the bone mass for 4 months had ruptured the moment the pressure was released. Suction, Crawford said, his voice calm but tight. The surgical nurse inserted the suction tube. Blood was pulled away, but more kept coming. I cannot see the source, one of the assistant surgeons said. Light to the left, Crawford ordered. The surgical lamp shifted. Now Crawford could see it. A small vessel deep in the tissue bleeding steadily. If they could not stop it, Werner would lose too much blood and go into shock. Crawford reached for a clamp. His hand did not tremble. After dozens of surgeries during the war, he had learned to control every muscle in his body to silence the fear that might cause a fatal mistake. He positioned the clamp carefully, feeling for the vessel with the tips of the instrument. One chance, if he missed, he would have to dig deeper into tissue that was already traumatized, increasing the risk of permanent damage. He closed the clamp. The bleeding stopped. Crawford exhaled slowly, but no one heard it over the hum of the equipment. The surgery continued. For the next 4 hours, Crawford worked to restore what the battlefield had destroyed. After clearing away the calcified overgrowth, he assessed the underlying vertebrae. The original fractures had healed, but in a misaligned position. The third vertebra sat at a slight forward angle relative to the fourth, which explained why Werner always held his head tilted slightly down. Crawford made a decision. He would not attempt to realign the healed fractures. The risk of destabilizing the spine was too great. Instead, he would focus on restoring mobility by creating space between the fused bone. Using a combination of drills, chisels, and careful manual pressure, Crawford separated the third and fourth vertebrae. Into the gap, he inserted a thin metal spacer, a small piece of surgical steel designed to hold the bones apart permanently while the surrounding tissue healed. Once the spacer was in place, Crawford tested the result. He gently moved Werner's head from side to side, rotating it a few degrees in each direction. The movement was limited, but it was present. For the first time in 4 months, Werner Hoffmann's neck could move. Crawford closed the incision with careful sutures layer by layer, ensuring that every piece of tissue was properly aligned for healing. Then Werner was transferred to the recovery ward. The clock on the operating room wall read 1 in the afternoon. The surgery had taken 6 hours. Major Crawford removed his surgical gloves and mask. His hands ached. His back was stiff from standing in the same position for 6 hours. But when one of the nurses asked how it went, he allowed himself a small nod. The boy will live, he said. Whether he will thank us for it remains to be seen. Recovery would be its own kind of battle, and Werner was about to discover that surviving the surgery was only the beginning. Werner woke in the recovery ward with his neck wrapped in bandages and his head immobilized in a rigid brace. The pain was immediate. It was severe. It was worse than anything he had experienced during the original injury. His entire neck felt like it was on fire, and every heartbeat sent a fresh wave of agony radiating down his spine. Morphine helped, but only partially. The drug dulled the sharpest edges of the pain without eliminating it entirely. Werner existed in a haze of discomfort, drifting in and out of consciousness, unable to tell whether minutes or hours were passing. For the first 3 days, he was not allowed to move his head at all. Nurses adjusted his position every few hours to prevent pressure sores, carefully rotating his body while keeping his neck perfectly still. He ate through a tube. He slept in short bursts interrupted by pain. But he was alive. On the 4th day, a physical therapist named Lieutenant Dorothy Walsh visited his bedside. She was 28 years old with short brown hair, cut in a practical style, and strong hands that had helped hundreds of wounded soldiers learn to move again. Through an interpreter, Walsh explained what came next. The goal is to gradually restore range of motion without displacing the metal spacer or damaging the healing tissue, she said. The process will take weeks, possibly months, and it will be painful. Werner listened without expression. He had been prepared for pain. He had lived with it for 4 months before the surgery. More pain was simply the price of survival. The rehabilitation began the next day. The first sessions involved passive exercises. Walsh moved Werner's head for him, gently rotating it a few degrees in each direction, stretching the scar tissue that had been locked in place for months. Each stretch felt like his neck was being torn apart from the inside. During the first week, Werner vomited twice from the intensity of the pain. Once he passed out during a session and had to be revived. But he did not quit. Every day, Walsh came to his bedside. Every day, she pushed him a little further. Every day, the range of motion increased by tiny increments. By the third week, Werner could turn his head 15 degrees to the left and 20 degrees to the right. By the sixth week, he could look over his shoulder. By the eighth week, he could tilt his head up and down without his hands going numb. Each improvement was a victory. Each degree of motion was proof that the surgery had worked, that the months of suffering had not been in vain. Walsh recorded every milestone with professional satisfaction. But privately, she marveled at the boy's determination. She had worked with soldiers who had far less severe injuries and far less will to recover. Werner Hoffman fought through pain that would have broken most men twice his age. She never told him this directly, but she made sure the other nurses knew, and word spread through the hospital about the German boy who refused to give up. 3 weeks after the surgery, Werner was allowed to eat solid food for the first time. Nurse Sullivan, who had stayed in Atlanta to monitor his recovery, brought him a breakfast tray that morning. On the tray were scrambled eggs, toast, and 3 strips of bacon. Werner looked at the food. He had never eaten bacon before. Smoked pork was not common in the part of Germany where he grew up, but the smell of it filled his nostrils and made his stomach clench with hunger. He picked up a strip of bacon with his fingers because holding a fork was still difficult and brought it to his mouth. The flavor exploded on his tongue. Salt, sweet, smoke, the crispy texture crumbling against his teeth, the rich fat melting on his lips. He chewed slowly, carefully, because swallowing still hurt. But each bite was a revelation. This was not prison food. This was not the stale bread and thin soup he had eaten for months in the camps. This was something entirely different, something that tasted like comfort and warmth and safety. Sullivan stood watching him eat, a small smile on her face. "Good?" she asked. Werner did not understand the word, but he understood the question. He nodded a motion that 3 weeks ago he could not have made and said one word. Ja, gut. Yes, good. This was the first meal in 4 months that Werner could swallow without choking on pain. The first time he tasted something that was not medicine or bland hospital food. The first moment when he understood that America, the enemy he had been taught to hate, could offer him something other than suffering. The bacon was more than food. It was a symbol, a small piece of kindness in the middle of a war that had tried to destroy him. Werner finished every strip on the plate, and when Sullivan asked if he wanted more, he nodded again. "Jay," he said, "bitte, please." Sullivan laughed and went to get another serving. In a hospital room in Atlanta, Georgia, a German prisoner of war discovered that his enemies could also be kind, and that discovery would stay with him for the rest of his life. During the 8th week of recovery, Major Crawford came to perform a final examination before Werner was transferred back to Camp Aliceville. Crawford measured the range of motion in Werner's neck, tested his reflexes, and reviewed a new set of x-rays. The metal spacer was still in place. The surrounding bone showed signs of healthy healing. The surgery had been a complete success. "The surgery worked," Crawford said through the interpreter. "You have recovered approximately 60% of normal neck mobility. You will never have full range of motion, and you will likely experience chronic pain for the rest of your life. But you will be able to live without holding your head in place with your hands." Werner listened to the translation. Then he asked a question that Crawford had not expected. "Warum?" Why the interpreter translated. "Why did you do this for me?" "I am the enemy." Crawford paused. He looked at the boy, 17 years old, with the long scar forming on the back of his neck, with eyes that held a mixture of confusion and gratitude. He thought about all the surgeries he had performed during the war. American soldiers mostly. Boys who reminded him of his own nephews. Boys who went off to fight and came back broken, needing someone to put them back together. But he also thought about something his father had told him years ago when Crawford was still a medical student. His father had been a doctor too, a general practitioner in a small town in Ohio. And he had said something that Crawford never forgot. A patient is a patient. The moment they are on your table, nothing else matters. Not their politics, not their nationality, not whether you agree with the war they were fighting. Your only job is to heal. Crawford looked at Werner and I gave his answer. On my operating table, there are no enemies. There are only patients. And my only job is to heal. Werner did not understand all the English words, but he understood the meaning. He understood that some principles transcended borders and battlefields, that some people chose to see the human being beneath the uniform. Danke, Werner said quietly. Danke, Herr Doctor. Thank you, Doctor. Crawford nodded. Then he turned and walked out of the room. It was the last time Werner Hoffman would see Major Charles Crawford. But he would never forget him, and he would spend the rest of his life trying to repay a debt that could never truly be repaid. In February of 1945, Werner was transferred back to Camp Aliceville. The ambulance pulled through the camp gates on a cold morning, and Dr. Whitfield was waiting. He had followed Werner's progress through reports from Atlanta, but this was the first time he would see the results with his own eyes. Werner stepped out of the ambulance under his own power. No stretcher, no wheelchair, just a young man with a scar on his neck and a slight stiffness in his movements. Whitfield called his name from the left side. Werner turned his head and looked at him. A simple motion, a motion that 4 months ago was impossible. A motion that represented hours of surgery, weeks of recovery, and the combined efforts of doctors and nurses who had chosen to see a patient instead of an enemy. Whitfield smiled. It was the first genuine smile he had allowed himself in months. "Welcome back," he said. Werner walked toward him, and for a moment the two men stood facing each other. The doctor who had fought the system to save a life. The boy who had survived against all odds. "Thank you," Werner said in careful English words he had practiced during his recovery. "Thank you, for my life." Whitfield nodded, his eyes slightly, wet though he would never admit it. "Live well," he said. "That is thanks enough." Sergeant Jennings was also present at the gate. He stood at a distance, watching silently. Werner did not know about the battle that had been fought over his surgery. He did not know about the reports and the delays and the attempts to block his transfer. All he knew was that he was alive and that the people who should have been his enemies had chosen to save him. As Werner walked past Jennings, he paused for a moment. The two men looked at each other. Jennings was the first to look away. He did not say anything. He did not need to. The boy's presence, alive and walking, was a defeat that no words could soften. Jennings had tried to let the system do what he could not do himself. He had tried to let bureaucracy accomplish what his grief demanded, and he had failed. Werner continued walking into the camp toward the barracks where he would spend the remaining months of the war. Behind him, Jennings stood alone, watching, saying nothing. Some battles are won without a single blow being struck. Some victories are measured not in territory gained, but in lives saved. Werner Hoffman was one of those victories, and Sergeant Harold Jennings would have to live with that for the rest of his life. In May of 1945, Germany surrendered. The news spread through Camp Aliceville like a wave. German prisoners reacted in different ways. Some celebrated because the war was finally over. Some wept for a country that no longer existed as they had known it. Some simply sat in silence, processing the reality that everything they had fought for was lost. Werner sat on his bunk when he heard the news. He did not feel joy. He did not feel sorrow. He only thought about one thing, his mother. Dortmund had been bombed heavily during the final months of the war. He did not know if his house still stood. He did not know if his mother and sister were alive. For months, he had tried not to think about it because thinking about it made the uncertainty unbearable. Several weeks later, he received word through the Red Cross. His mother was alive. His sister Liesel was alive. The house had been destroyed, but they had evacuated to a small village outside the city before the bombs fell. Werner read the letter alone, sitting on his bunk. Then he wept. These were the first tears he had shed since the artillery barrage in France. Not tears of pain, not tears of fear. Tears of relief, tears of gratitude. Tears for a family he had thought he might never see again. He clutched the letter to his chest and let himself cry until there were no tears left. And when he was finished, he felt lighter than he had in years. The war was over. His family was alive, and he had survived. 3 months later, Dr. Whitfield received a telegram that changed everything he believed about the world. Daniel was coming home. His son had been wounded at Okinawa. a piece of shrapnel in his shoulder. But a Navy surgeon had saved his arm. The surgeon was Japanese-American Anise, who had volunteered to serve despite everything his family had endured in the internment camps. Whitfield read the telegram, standing in his office, hands trembling. He thought about Werner. He thought about Crawford. He thought about all the doctors who had chosen to see patients instead of enemies, to see human beings instead of uniforms. And he understood something that he would carry with him for the rest of his life. Mercy was not weakness. It was the thread that held humanity together even when everything else was falling apart. In June of 1946, 1 year after the war ended, Werner Hoffman was finally allowed to return home. On the day he left Camp Aliceville, Dr. Whitfield stood at the gate to say goodbye. The two men had spent 18 months in the same camp, connected by a surgery that had saved one life and redeemed another. They had never truly been able to communicate, separated by language and circumstance, but they had shared something deeper than words. Werner stood before Whitfield and spoke in the English he had learned during his time in the camp. "Thank you," he said. "For my life, I will not forget." Whitfield nodded. His eyes were moist, but he did not cry. "Live well," he said. "That is all the thanks I need." Werner turned away, turned his head, not his body, a motion that had once been impossible. And he walked toward the truck that would take him to the port, to the ship, to the country he had left as a boy and would return to as a man. Whitfield watched until the truck disappeared around a bend in the road. Then he went back to work. There were other patients who needed him, other battles to fight, other lives to save. But he never forgot Werner Hoffman, and he never forgot the lesson that saving one life had taught him. Some things are worth fighting for, even when the system says no, even when the odds seem impossible, even when the person you are fighting for is supposed to be your enemy. That was the lesson, and Whitfield carried it with him for the rest of his career. Harold Jennings retired from the Army in 1947. He returned to his hometown in Kansas and lived quietly for the next 30 years. He never spoke about the German boy with the broken neck. He never told anyone about the reports he had filed or the battles he had lost. But every year on the anniversary of his son's death, he visited Thomas's grave in the local cemetery and sat there for hours. Sometimes he wondered if Thomas, had he survived, would have been proud of what his father tried to do. The answer never came. Perhaps that was punishment enough. Margaret Sullivan continued nursing for another 30 years. She never married. When asked why, she would smile and say she had found her family in the wards, in the faces of the patients she had helped heal. She kept a photograph on her desk until the day she retired. A young German soldier with a scar on his neck, standing at the gates of Camp Aliceville, turning his head to wave goodbye. She never told anyone who he was. But when she looked at that photograph, she remembered the night she sat beside his bed in the darkness, and he whispered the word for mother in German, and she understood that some things needed no translation. That was enough. 40 years passed. Werner Hoffman returned to Germany and rebuilt his life from the ruins of war. He married Ingrid, a young woman from the village where his mother and sister had sheltered during the bombing. They had 3 children, 2 sons and a daughter. He worked as a machinist, then as a factory supervisor, then retired to a small house with a garden where he grew tomatoes and roses. The scar on his neck never fully faded. The pain never completely disappeared, especially on cold days when the metal spacer seemed to conduct the chill directly into his bones. But he lived. He raised his family. He watched his children grow and have children of their own. Every year on December 14th, the anniversary of his surgery, Werner wrote a letter. The letters were addressed to the family of Major Charles Crawford. Crawford himself had died in 1979, but Werner continued writing to his widow, then to his children, then to his grandchildren. 35 letters in 35 years. In each letter, Werner described his life. He told them about his family, his work, his joys and sorrows. He thanked them for the gift of time that their father and grandfather had given him. He reminded them that one act of mercy had created ripples that spread across decades. The first letter began with these words: "Dear family of Dr. Crawford, you may not remember me. I was the German boy with the broken neck whom Dr. Crawford operated on in December of 1944. I am writing to you on the first anniversary of that surgery, the surgery that saved my life. Dr. Crawford asked me why I agreed to take the risk. I told him that I wanted to use my hands for something other than holding my head. Now I can tell you what that something is. I use my hands to hold my wife. To carry my firstborn son, to write this letter. Thank you. Not for saving my life, but for giving me the chance to live it. Every letter ended the same way, with gratitude that cannot be measured and debt that can never be repaid. Werner Hoffman. In 2019, 75 years after the surgery, a woman named Emily Crawford was cleaning out the basement of her late grandfather's house in San Antonio, Texas. Emily was 67 years old, a retired school teacher with 3 grown children and 7 grandchildren. Her grandfather, Major Charles Crawford, had died in 1979 when she was just 27. She remembered him as a quiet man who rarely spoke about the war, preferring to spend his retirement gardening and reading medical journals. In a cardboard box behind an old filing cabinet, Emily found a bundle of letters. 35 letters, all from Germany, all written in careful English by someone who had learned the language as a second tongue. She read them one by one, sitting on the dusty basement floor, tears streaming down her face. She had never known about Werner Hoffman. Her grandfather had never mentioned the German boy whose life he had saved. The letters had arrived year after year, and her grandfather had kept every single one, but he had never shared them with anyone. When she finished reading, Emily knew what she had to do. She contacted the World War II Veterans Association. She reached out to German historical societies. She searched through records and databases until she found what she was looking for. Werner Hoffman had died in 2015 at the age of 88, but he had children and grandchildren who were still alive, still living in Germany, still carrying the legacy of a life that had been saved by an American surgeon in 1944. Emily wrote to them. In the summer of 2020, 76 years after the surgery, Werner Hoffman's grandson came to America for the first time. Marcus Hoffman was 42 years old, an engineer from Munich, who had grown up hearing stories about his grandfather's miraculous survival. He had seen the scar on the old man's neck. He had heard about the surgery that should have been impossible. He had listened to Werner talk about the American doctor who had treated him as a patient, not as an enemy. But Marcus had never expected to stand in the hallway of a hospital in Atlanta, Georgia, holding a piece of metal in his hand. The metal spacer had been removed from Werner's neck in 1985 when he required a second surgery due to age-related complications. Werner had kept it in a small box on his dresser for the remaining 30 years of his life. It was a reminder, he said, of the day he started living again. Marcus had brought it to America, a gift for the Crawford family, a piece of history that connected 2 families across generations and oceans. Emily Crawford met him at Lawson General Hospital, which had long since been converted to a civilian facility. They stood in the hallway on the 3rd floor near where the neurosurgery ward had once been located. "My grandfather lived to be 91, Marcus said. He had a good life. 3 children, 6 grandchildren. He watched the Berlin Wall fall. He saw Germany reunified. He held his great-grandchildren in his arms. He paused, struggling to control his emotions. All of it," he continued. "Every moment of the last 70 years. It happened because of your grandfather." Emily took the metal spacer in her hands. It was smaller than she expected, lighter. Just a thin piece of surgical steel, no bigger than a coin. But it had kept 2 vertebrae apart. It had allowed a boy to turn his head. It had given him decades of life that should have been impossible. "My grandfather never talked about the war," Emily said. "He never mentioned your grandfather. But he kept every letter, every single one. He must have read them over and over." She looked at Marcus. "I think your grandfather meant more to him than he ever admitted to anyone. I think saving that one life was the thing he was most proud of in his entire career." Marcus nodded, and unable to speak. They stood there in silence for a long moment, the grandson of the patient and the granddaughter of the surgeon, connected by a surgery that had happened 3/4 of a century ago. Then Emily did something unexpected. She handed the spacer back to Marcus. "Keep it," she said. "It belonged to your grandfather. It is part of his story, not mine. Take it back to Germany. Show it to your children. Tell them what it means." Marcus looked at her, surprised. "Are you sure?" Emily smiled through her tears. "The story is what matters," she said, "not the metal. My grandfather would have wanted the story to live on. That is his real legacy." Marcus closed his fingers around the spacer. Such a small thing, such a light thing. But it carried the weight of history, the weight of mercy, the weight of lives transformed. "Thank you," he said, "for everything your family did." Emily shook her head. "Thank your grandfather," she said. "He was the one who survived. He was the one who wrote the letters. He was the one who made sure the story would never be forgotten. They stood together for another moment. Then by unspoken agreement, they walked out of the hospital together into the summer sunshine, into a world that had been shaped by one surgery on a cold December morning 76 years ago. The story of Werner Hoffmann was rare, but the system that saved him was not. During World War II, more than 11 million soldiers became prisoners of war across all theaters of combat. Germany held approximately 3.5 million Allied prisoners. The Allies held approximately 4 million German and Italian prisoners. The United States alone held over 400,000 German prisoners in camps scattered across the country. Camp Aliceville in Alabama was one of the largest, housing up to 6,000 men at its peak. The Geneva Convention of 1929 required all nations to provide necessary medical treatment to prisoners. The United States and the United Kingdom generally adhered to this requirement. Many prisoners received surgeries and treatments that would have been impossible in their home countries due to wartime resource shortages. More than 70,000 German prisoners were treated in American military hospitals during the war. Thousands of those treatments involved complex surgeries that saved lives and restored function. Werner Hoffmann was one of those thousands. His case became part of the medical literature on spinal trauma studied by neurosurgeons for decades afterward. The techniques developed during his surgery contributed to advances in cervical spine treatment that benefited patients around the world. But the numbers do not tell the whole story. The real story is about choices. The choice of a doctor to fight for a patient when the system said no. The choice of a surgeon to see a human being instead of an enemy. The choice of nurses and therapists to provide comfort and care across the barriers of language and nationality. These choices were made thousands of times during the war in hospitals and camps and battlefields around the world. Most of them were never recorded. Most of the people who made them were never recognized. But their legacy lives on in the lives they saved, in the families that exist because of them, in the generations of children and grandchildren who owe their existence to moments of mercy that transcended the boundaries of war. Werner Hoffmann was one of those lives. And his story is a reminder that even in the darkest times, human beings are capable of extraordinary compassion. If this story has meaning for you, carry it forward. Share it with others. Remember that the choices we make, the small acts of kindness and courage that seem insignificant in the moment, can ripple outward across decades and generations. Werner Hoffmann held his head in his hands for 4 months because no one would help him. Then he held his wife, his children, his grandchildren, because someone chose to see him as a patient instead of an enemy. That is the power of mercy. That is the legacy of one surgery on a December morning in 1944. That is the story of the boy who could not turn his head, and the people who gave him his life back.